A new world order is emerging, a new axis of world powers with common grievances and one common enemy. No prizes for guessing which one, the United States of America. A country which has for decades tried to shape our world in its image and established its preeminence in almost every facet of power, be it military, economy, technology, culture, or morality for that matter. It is America the world looks up to, all thanks to its global influence networks and, of course, the American PR machinery. But what if I tell you that things are changing? That America's global empire is crumbling, the hegemony of Western nations is dying, and a new alliance is looking to replace it, an alliance led by three countries: Russia, China, and Iran. The three most sanctioned countries in the world. They seem to have formed a rather informal alliance of convenience, a loose alliance of sorts which the West is calling a troika of tyranny, and a triad of bullies. What have they done to deserve such titles, and can they really reshape the prevailing world order? Or will they instead push the world into further disorder? And above everything else, where does India fit in this new axis? Does it have any reason to worry? We'll find out over the next few minutes. Hello and welcome to Gravitas Plus. My name is Priyanka Sharma. A new global alliance is now in the making, an alliance between China, Iran, and Moscow. They're forging their strategic, defense, and economic ties. It doesn't take a genius to notice the pattern. Just look at some recent developments. Ever since Russia invaded Ukraine, the three countries have come closer. Yes, China is uncomfortable with the war, but it still provides Russia with a diplomatic umbrella. It is also helping Moscow economically by rejecting the G7's price caps on oil. The same case with Iran. It is still buying Russian oil and sending weapons in return. Yes, for the last 1 year, Tehran has sent countless kamikaze drones. And if reports are to be believed, it might just send ballistic missiles by this October. These deals are being accompanied by state visits. Leaders and officials from all three countries have been frequently flying to each other's capitals. In July last year, the Russian president went to Tehran. He met his counterpart, Ibrahim Raisi, and discussed strengthening bilateral ties. Contrary to expectations, Iran didn't downplay this visit. In fact, it rolled out a red carpet for Vladimir Putin. The Iranian oil minister personally went to greet Putin. And then in November, a group of Russian security officials visited Iran. Their aim was to find ways to counter Western pressure on both countries. Syria is another good example. Another good example of the Iranian and Russian interests coming together. For years now, both sides have been trying to keep Bashar al-Assad in power. Their only aim is to counter American interests in Syria. Just last week, the US shot down Iranian-made spy drones in Syria. And if we speak of Russia, despite being militarily involved in Ukraine, Russia still maintains a military presence in Syria, an indication that it's not leaving the country anytime soon. And if we speak of Russian and Iranian cooperation in Syria, it's a tale that gets murkier the deeper you dig. Russia continues to provide a decisive cover to Syrian and Iranian-backed ground forces in Syria. And then, of course, we have China. Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russia's Putin recently caught up over a phone call. This was around New Year's Eve. The two sides released statements saying the ties are at their historic best. What's more, Putin said he's expecting a state visit from Xi Jinping soon. "We are expecting you, dear friend," was the message from Moscow. We are hardly surprised. The entire world knows about China's bonhomie with Russia, and we'll focus on China's love affair with Iran, an affair getting intense by the day. You see, in 2021, China and Iran signed a 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership deal, a deal that has given China its deepest ever foothold in Iran, with many Iranians even saying that the deal has literally sold Iran to China. But the Islamic Republic's leadership doesn't see it that way. Why? Because in return, Iran was made a permanent member of the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a body led by China. It's the largest regional organization in terms of world population, global GDP, and geographic scope. Iran's membership in this body does little for the region it represents, but more for the powers that run it, Russia and China. With Iran on their side, their ambitions of countering the West get greater legitimacy and support. For Iran, this membership helps it battle the economic isolation from the West. So it's a win-win deal of sorts. In December last year, China's Vice Premier Hu Shunhua flew down to Tehran, and more recently, Iran's president visited China, Ibrahim Raisi. He was in Beijing from the 14th of February to the 16th. The Chinese president gave him a red carpet welcome, followed by a guard of honor by the Chinese military. The arrangements were grand, to say the least. They had to be. After all, this was the first state visit by an Iranian leader to China in almost 2 decades, and Raisi didn't go to Beijing alone. He took along a huge entourage of ministers. The biggest Iranian delegation to Beijing ever. This included 6 members of Raisi's cabinet. In an editorial about the visit, China's mouthpiece, the Global Times, said that the visit was proof that an anti-Western front is growing. Allow me to quote the most telling excerpt from the report. It said, China's deepening cooperation with Iran also has an anti-hegemony and anti-bullying feature. Both China and Iran uphold independent foreign policies, firmly defend the principle of non-interference in internal affairs on international occasions. If anyone feels targeted in this process, then they should first reflect on whether they are too selfish. So how do we perceive such statements and developments? Do they indicate the consolidation of an anti-Western axis? Do they indicate the rise of a new world order? It certainly seems like it, and the American media can't stop talking about it. For the last 2 months, there have been endless reports of how China, Iran, and Moscow had joined hands against the West, how Washington will have to take on all 3 at the same time. And not just these 3. Reports say the triad also has a posse of sorcerers' apprentices. What do I mean by that? Smaller nations that agree with their vision, namely Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cambodia, Myanmar, and the most important of them all, North Korea. A country which of late has been flexing its ballistic muscles way too much. So to put it simply, China, Russia, and Iran want to unite all like-minded countries behind them and use them as a solid front to counter Western hegemony. This seems like a page straight from the Western Alliance building playbook. In the days ahead, you can expect these countries to go all guns blazing on the West. You can expect to see them blaming the West for their ills on global forums and using their vote at the UNSC or the UNGA to thwart the multilateral system. The big question, where will all this leave India? Will India be collateral damage in this game plan? Well, we wouldn't go so far as to say that. You see, India has historic ties with Russia. India and Iran also share a cordial relationship. China is obviously an exception. It never fails to provoke India. Yet, New Delhi and Beijing have managed to not let the tensions flare up dramatically. So should India worry about this alliance? We don't think so. This triad just has one rotten apple as far as India is concerned, China. I don't think the other members of this alliance, both present and future, would square off against India, especially Russia and Iran. One can't imagine these two joining an anti-India alliance. In fact, this alliance isn't even about India. It's about the West, its monopoly, its dominance, its brazen lectures, and its selfish wars. My point is simple. Russia, China, and Iran may have their own ulterior motives. They may have their own differences with the West, but their plan might find takers simply because way too many countries are fed up with the West treating the world like their playground, waging wars at whim, imposing sanctions at whim, and preaching to others at whim. Their superpower status may have crumbled, but their sense of entitlement clearly has not. And this sense of entitlement is exactly what's uniting others against them. Think about it.
Get-Go News. For Resource Investment Conference. To you by First Mining Gold.
I'm Michelle McCory, and we are back at the Vancouver Resource Investment Conference, where one of the big themes has been the challenge to the dollar-dominated monetary system. And my next guest says a global monetary reset is already underway. Andy Schechtman is the president and owner of Miles Franklin Precious Metals. He has 3 decades of experience in the precious metal sector and is a very well-regarded expert on monetary history and political economy. Welcome to Kitco, Andy.
Thanks for having me, Michelle. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. Although, as I said to you earlier, it's a little bit terrifying hearing what you break down for us. And it all hinges off this idea of de-dollarization, which seems to be gaining momentum following Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the way the dollar has been increasingly weaponized, taking Russia off the SWIFT system. The BRICS taking notice of this and saying, well, perhaps we should have our own currency backed by commodities. We've seen those conversations happen and develop following the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which arguably was a disaster. We had Saudi Arabia question whether they want to be part of the BRICS and question their relationship with the United States. And we've also got Russia, for example, offering to help Iran with a gold-backed stable coin. So we have all of these pieces falling into place, and perhaps not coincidentally, we've also seen central banks buying gold at record rates. Now, you say all of these are just data points that if you connect them together, you see a narrative that points towards a global monetary reset. And it all started for you in 2017 when you saw that the Bundesbank, Germany, was repatriating its gold. So why don't we take it from there, Andy? Break down your thesis, joining those dots for us.
Sure, thank you. That's well done. That's a good roadmap. So it's true. You know, at the end of 2011, as the bull market started to head down into a bear market, by 2017 we saw capitulation on many levels, not only with the retail investor but also the central banks. Central banks were selling their gold. It really never made a whole lot of sense to me. And by 2017, we were at really at the peak of the bear market in precious metals, and this was when Bitcoin was taking off. And there were a lot of people selling their gold, and talks of central banks divesting of gold and investing in treasuries or income-producing assets. And then out of nowhere, a story popped up that the Bundesbank had been trying to repatriate their gold for a few years, but started to really make a big deal of it in 2017. It caught my eye. Why would they want to repatriate their gold from the New York Fed in the midst of what seemed to be a movement away from precious metals and into other forms of investment? It was very interesting they made such a big deal, and within a few weeks of that you had the Bank of Turkey and the Bank of Austria and the Dutch National Bank and the Czech National Bank and the Bank of Poland, and all of these banks, the Bank of Hungary, they were all saying, send us our gold back, not just from the New York Fed, but also from the Bank of England. And so it began a movement that really caught my eye. And now in 2018, the following year, this really accentuated when those same banks bought more gold as a group than they did in the 60 years previously combined. Now I'm starting to get really interested and really aware of what was happening. 2019 comes along, those numbers jump by almost 100%, north of 90%. The accumulation of gold by these central banks, which was out of nowhere, really, if we look back over the previous decade. And then the Bank of International Settlements came out with the declaration of revaluing gold as a high-quality liquid asset. Now, there's been some dispute, is it a tier one or is it a high-quality liquid asset? In the end, they're the same thing. It's as good as cash. When it's a hedged position, it is viewed by the Bank of International Settlements as good as cash. And I think if you look at that and realize that the acquisition of gold and the repatriation of gold, which was almost two and a half years prior to this admission, you wonder, were they clued in on the revaluation of gold or on the reclassification of it? Were they told, get your house in order, repatriate your gold? You might want to stop buying it because we're going to reclassify it as good as cash. So this really started to get me interested in what was happening. And
so just to interrupt you there, would the U.S. have been left out of that conversation?
No, they were not. This was all part of the Basel III.
Right, but I'm saying if they were telling central banks, you should start repatriating gold, this is what's going to happen.
Whether or not they were left out of it or they just decided not to do it or accumulated other ways is, I guess, debatable. And, you wonder where Gaddafi's gold is, where Saddam Hussein's gold is. Just saying, the Ukraine sold $25 billion worth of gold to fund the war. Where did that go? So I don't know where the U.S., if the U.S. was accumulating gold or if they weren't, or if they were getting it in other ways. but the U.S. certainly wasn't part of the narrative. These were all the Eastern European banks, and ironically, most of the banks that were doing it were either part of the European Union or in that general region, but most of them did not trade the euro. They traded their own currency within the European Union. So these are the banks that I believe ultimately will shift towards the BRICS nations. I digress. 2020, I start to notice the second very interesting piece of the puzzle, and that was the Chinese Belt Road and Rail Initiative. And this is the largest infrastructure project in human history, and it's connecting Asia and Africa and parts of South America and Europe, the old Silk Road.
But that's been developing for what, over a decade
It
now?
has been, but it really started to gain traction in 2020. And I'm looking at it and realizing that all 13 OPEC producing countries are on the Belt Road. Almost 70% of human population and 40% of global GDP on this growing group of countries. And it's all void of U.S. dollar participation. Most of it settling on the new Chinese digital yuan. And so it started to get I started to get this feeling that, look, a lot of the countries that are part of the Belt Road, China and India and Russia, and these are countries that are accumulating all of the gold and producing all of the gold. And you start to see this growing group of countries and kind of the isolation of the dollar. Now, this really didn't all fit into what I was talking about until shortly after 2021. 2020, the banks are still buying gold. And 2021 rolls around and we see the day that we leave Afghanistan in a very unharmonious way. Saudi Arabia, I think, at that point, signed the death warrant for the end of the petrodollar. The day we left Afghanistan or the day after, and I think there is no coincidence in the timing, Saudi Arabia announces a joint military cooperation agreement with Russia. You know, I often ask...
And just to recap, leaving Afghanistan, deserting weapons, deserting allies,
Yes.
deserting personnel.
Leaving our own servicemen and women behind enemy lines was something that would have been considered inconceivable in the United States that I grew up in. And I think that really signaled something to our allies and certainly to our foes. And, I asked people what makes the dollar the world reserve currency, and most people don't know. But in 1974, 3 years after we closed the gold window, Kissinger went to Saudi Arabia and struck a deal with the Saudi kingdom and said, hey, we'll protect you, but for that, you'll denominate oil globally in dollars. And they have through OPEC. And this has created a massive synthetic demand for the dollar for the last 50 years. Signaling a change in that by a joint military cooperation agreement with Russia was a huge, huge move that really got very little, if any, attention in the Western media. But now things are really starting to click in for me, and I'm starting to see not only global de-dollarization, but also groupings that are growing together, like all 13 of the OPEC producing countries on the Belt Road, like shortly thereafter, China and Nigeria, who also signed the same contract with Russia, selling their gold to China for the Petro Yuan bond, which is immediately convertible into gold on the Shanghai Gold Exchange. And this is how countries like Iran have sidestepped sanctions for quite some time, selling their oil to China for a bond that is immediately convertible into gold, and they take possession of it right off the Shanghai Gold Exchange. So these things are starting to speed up at this point, and I'm really starting to notice that there's a growing group of countries that are formulating around the BRICS that are, I think, coalescing against the dollar, the hypocrisy, the hegemony of the dollar, and you could see it, you could feel it, and you could watch all of the gold that was being sent eastward, and the accumulation and the de-dollarization. 2022 rolls along, and the weaponization of the dollar, as you mentioned, where I believe it's not the prerogative of the West to say who can and can't use the world reserve currency. It should be more for public opinion, not for the administrator of the currency to decide who can and can't use it. And it was that moment, and I often ask people, do you think this was intended? We have 130 trillion in debt, 31 trillion that's on balance sheet, and Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security, which is 55 trillion underfunded in and of itself, and government military pensions, render us insolvent. Most of this debt accumulated at the lowest interest rates in human history. Was it intended? Did we want to pick a villain to create this great reset, to accept, to all of a sudden start the de-dollarization. And this is where the story gets very interesting as it turns from here.
Okay, well let's revisit some of those points there. So the dollar starts to unravel in this narrative when Saudi Arabia starts to make deals with China and the petrodollar is in jeopardy.
Yes.
So you're saying Saudi Arabia is now looking at Russia for protection.
Yes.
And if you're Saudi Arabia, you're thinking two things. For one thing, you're watching how the dollar was weaponized in the Russia invasion of Ukraine, and you're going, well, we don't want that. We can't have that happen to our assets. What if the U.S. wakes up one morning and don't like our human rights policies, for example, or something else, or some other situation that could happen in the Middle East and decides to do the same to us? Maybe this isn't the best way to keep our reserves. But you've also got Russia not really projecting tremendous strength via this conflict in Ukraine. So why would the Saudis make such a bold decision before seeing who is the bigger military power in play?
Yes, that is part of the equation. That's a fair statement. This was before the Ukraine invasion, number one, and secondly, the day after these announcements came out, Zero Hedge ran an article saying Saudi Arabia announces to the world that their nuclear submarines are outfitted with hypersonic ICBMs. This is the technology the West doesn't have. The State Department commented and said they're very concerned about it. These are the missiles that can go Mach 10 up in the atmosphere and hit the ground at the speed of an asteroid. That was, I think, their way of saying, don't even try to do what you did to Gaddafi and Hussein. Don't even think about it. It was a veiled threat, let's say. And I think this is another reason why when you realize that also last year we see the Saudis say, well, we have submitted our application to the BRICS. So you have a growing unison of countries that are joining together that in and of themselves maybe can't project that strength, maybe can't stand up to the West, but together as a group, their militaries are stronger, their GDPs are bigger. I think it's a growing chorus of countries standing up to that hypocrisy, standing up to the West in a way that they've never been able to do in and of themselves. And
well, we'll leave the word hypocrisy aside for now, but let's just say standing up to a system where the U.S. can continue to print dollars, and then that makes the debt that they owe the U.S. become bigger and bigger and bigger.
Absolutely.
So we'll put aside the moral argument of the U.S.'s role on the global stage.
Yes, and it is a perceived hypocrisy. I'm not saying it is, but that's their perception.
That's a fair enough point. So we're going to see this bifurcation of the global monetary system.
Absolutely.
Break that down in further detail. How does this play out from here?
Well, you have all of these countries joining the BRICS that you put them all together along with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the Belt Road. You're talking north of 80% of human population, and all it would take. Now, you have to remember, we're coming from a period of time where asset prices were blown sky high over the last several years, with more money being created in the last 3 than in the history of the country preceding it. A lot of that money found its way into assets, and you have the misallocation and the distortions that are created by this. All it would take would be for Saudi Arabia to stand up on the stage, as they just told the folks at the Davos conference that we're now going to consider taking other currencies for oil. We've already been told that the BRICS currency would be pegged to gold or to commodities, and the assumption being gold being one of the commodities. I think all it would take would be Saudi Arabia to say to the West, thanks for the memories, it's been great, we appreciate it, but we're going to open up oil purchases in other currencies, not just dollars, maybe euros and ruble and rupee and gold, and all of a sudden, bang, all of the countries that have had to hold dollars for the last 50 years no longer really have any interest in
It's like a
holding
bird
them. And
beak
if they
right
all
here.
start to dump dollars, and I think it would happen quickly,
You
or
got
they
the
would all
holes
dump
in the
dollars,
beak
you have a
or the
tsunami
eyes
of
the
inflation
bird.
hitting the
There's
shores of
another
the West
something going on
that
here.
would immediately create a spike in interest rates to compensate for the loss of purchasing power. This is how we see a great reset, as interest rates spike in relation to a crashing dollar, which then is inversely correlated to asset prices that have gone stratospheric over the last few years, and I would argue irrationally. And as interest rates spike and this inverse correlation hits the shores, stocks, bonds, and real estate, along with the crashing dollar, all collapse at the very same time. And when I asked, do you think it was intended? I guess I'm kind of tongue in cheek, but if you think about it, now you have a villain. Instead of blaming the Fed for creating these distortions and letting this happen, you have the Fed there saying they're going to raise rates, but they've done a woeful job at raising them high enough to tackle inflation.
All right, let's put a pause on that one before we get into the Great Reset, which I understand also opens the way for central bank digital currencies and a complete revamp of the system. And let's first focus on how we get to this de-dollarized global economy, or at least an economy where the dollar plays a less significant role. So in this bifurcation of the global monetary system, what relevance does the dollar have?
The dollar will
I mean,
always,
it's still in play.
yeah, the dollar will always have a relevance to it, and maybe it's not in its current state. But the thing that I think is really important to understand is that these agreements that are being made with the BRICS represent such a massive part of GDP and of population. At what point does the West decide to or attempt to trade with this group? Are they even going to be welcomed into it? I don't know. It just seems they're being isolated.
Well, because the dollar is so powerful, and because the United States has enjoyed so much privilege having the global reserve currency, why would it just give it up without a fight?
Well, they will fight, and they won't just give it up. But a lot of people will make the analogy to the euro, that all these countries came together and it didn't work. And I think there's something to be said for that. But when you look at all of these countries coming together in a similar rallying cry, for whatever that rallying cry is against the West, it is the backing of the new system by commodities, and perhaps all of it denoted on a distributed ledger. The digital yuan, which has been running for the last 4 years, backing the Belt Road to the tune of over 20 billion in successful transactions, would be, I believe, the rails to a new BRICS currency that would show the immutability of what every country pegged or pledged to the new system. That gives it the glue to make it work, where everyone has the same equal footing, equal say at the table. This, to me, is what would make the system work. As Zoltan Pozsar calls it, a new system backed by commodities, Bretton Woods 3, rather than a system backed by debt instruments and promises.
And Andy, we have had other guests on the show, Frank Juster for one, who mentioned this over a year ago, that he sees the trend developing where you will have a central bank digital currency or digital currency on the blockchain, backed, not necessarily pegged, backed by gold and a basket of other commodities. And the transparency that the blockchain allows creates a sense of faith amongst the other countries, going to the expression that there is perhaps distrust amongst them with regards to how they handle their own affairs. Right. So, but again, the idea that the United States is just going to hope that it will be included in this trade system, it just seems a bit far-fetched that there wouldn't be a more aggressive push to maintain that kind of status. Well, what would that look like? What would that look like?
I don't know exactly what that looks like. I'm sure they'll resort to any and all options.
Is it a war? Is it a kinetic war?
It certainly looks like we're heading in that direction right now. With what's happening, we're funding the Ukraine to a total of almost $100 billion. We're selling them Stinger missiles and drones, providing, tanks and intelligence. I mean, you could argue in a court of law, we would be an accomplice to a crime. You could argue we are moving in that direction, and maybe that is what they're going to resort to. But I don't know. And I think the bottom line is simply this: we are indebted to a level that will never pay it back, and interest rates are rising. So at what point do people want to start receiving something that is tangible for the commodities that they're trading or for the business that they're doing with a country that is paying them in inflated dollars? And the market is rife with risk at this point in a rising interest rate market. I think the bloom is off the rose for the West. So what does it entail? How do they fight back? I'm sure they will, and maybe it is war. I don't know, but your point is valid.
Is the conflict then against the Saudis or the Chinese? Because it seems as though you're saying that the Saudis are the kingmakers in all of this if they come out and say no more petrodollar. So who would the U.S. potentially direct its wrath at?
That's a good question. I think the Saudis are joining the BRICS nations so that they have protection from countries that have the ability to back them and stand up to the West. I think, certainly the Saudis would be the linchpin of it all.
Yeah.
But if they're joining a group that has the ability to stand behind them and protect them as part of a unified nation or a unified group, it would seem that they're picking a fight with everybody.
Right. Well, let's focus on the R in the BRICS, and that's Russia, because a lot of this depends on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which many would say is a proxy war, with the US really being so active and participating now, sending tanks, which was a line they said that they wouldn't cross initially. Potentially, there's now a request from Ukraine for F-16s.
Right.
We'll see if that happens. If Russia loses this war, what does it mean for this whole reset theory? Does it jeopardize the BRICS' ability to launch this currency that challenges the dollar?
It may slow things down, it may derail it, it may change the way that it plays out. But look, ever since the sanctions, you're still seeing north of 80% of the world trading with Russia. It hasn't bothered the majority of the world. So, and I guess what does lose mean? I don't know. How bad does this get, and who gets dragged into it? There are a lot of what ifs and suppositions there. I don't know, and these are all valid points. And again, this is a chain of events that I've seen accumulating over time, and I guess there's fluidity to it. There's no question about it, and it certainly, it certainly changes, making this something that's cut and dry. There will be an outcome that I guess we'll have to see, but I don't think it changes the global de-dollarization, the global drive away from the dollars. And if Russia is hampered in any way by their ability to hold up their end of the bargain with the BRICS, so be it. I still don't think it changes the ultimate move away from the U.S.
Well,
dollar.
look, Andy, every global reserve currency known to man has lost its place in the sun. So it has been dethroned. It is sort of the natural cycle of events. And to your point about these countries sort of not really paying that much attention to the sanctions, we just had Yellen in South Africa speaking to President Cyril Ramaphosa saying, hey, you guys are kind of contravening the sanctions a little bit. You need to play nicely. But we don't know how much weight her word has if we're not seeing the U.S. willing to back it up with what, military, right? I mean, is that what it comes to? Why have people played along all this time? Was it because of the assumed military might of the United States?
I think it had a lot to do with it. And look, a lot of these countries a decade ago were in no position to do this. When in 1974, when Kissinger signed this contract, the Middle East was a poor area. They weren't enriched and they weren't developed the way that they are right now. And you could say the same thing about China. The progression that they've made as an industrialized nation is extraordinary. So I guess it's just, like you said, to your point, it's the time. You go back to the 1400s, almost every currency had between an 80 and 100-year lifespan. We're already
18 views 5 months ago.
On the outskirts of that, living on borrowed time, you could argue from an historical perspective. So maybe we've just run the course of our currency.
Andy, who's on Team Dollar? Who would prefer the dollar other than the United States? Although you argue that this may be a way to reset everything, and we'll get back to that. But who would prefer for the dollar to maintain its status?
I suppose those countries that are part of the Western Alliance: Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, Japan. And I don't know if they really do want it to continue. I don't know who is on Team Dollar. I guess I haven't thought that far out, to be quite honestly. I haven't thought about it that way. I guess all I'm looking at is mathematics. And when you see such a massive shift of human population coalescing against the dollar, and it's very obvious to see when you see shifts away from accepting the dollar for oil by countries already, and admissions by Saudi Arabia to look to other currencies, I think you have to take a real hard look at what happens if all of a sudden the world doesn't need to own dollars to buy oil.
And it's not just oil, because we're seeing a move away from U.S. treasuries globally. Well, certainly from China.
Of course. Right? Not just China, Saudi Arabia, all of these countries. Why would anyone buy our treasuries earning 3% with inflation double that by metrics that arguably are wrong? I don't know if you've ever had John Williams with Shadow Stats on your show, but he'll show you numbers that the way the inflation was calculated prior to 1980, when they changed the numbers, and he would say inflation's at 15% right now. But even using 7% inflation with a 3.5% yield on the 10-year Treasury, you're guaranteed a real return of negative 3.5% compounding over 10 years.
Unreal.
Why would anyone want to do that? And so you're right, it's not just the dollar market, it is the Treasury market. And we are incentivizing by the underperformance and the mismanagement of the dollar and what's happened to the yields on the treasuries for other people or for these countries to find other ways.
And I guess, they're looking at the US with this unprecedented fiscal and monetary stimulus printing away and saying, well, now our debts are larger. The US is just devaluing our reserves. So I can understand how the sentiment against the dollar would be building up in this scenario. So let's assume this does play out and we do have a split in the monetary system and the dollar loses its value and perhaps this BRICS reserve currency, which is digital, which is backed by commodities, comes into play and becomes a leading player on the global stage. Walk us through what happens to the dollar and for those holding dollars back home.
Yeah, I think at that point, you have a wave of dollar selling. Every country on the planet, nearly 85% of all oil sales have been in dollars for, I don't know, the last 50 years, if not more. All of these countries, it's the foundation of their currencies. And if all of a sudden the dollar starts to tank, it'll be a tsunami of selling, sell, in order to not be crushed by the wave of selling. And I think when that happens, and you have all of the dollars hitting the shores here, you have that inflationary spike in interest rates. It has to compensate for the loss of purchasing power. Interest rates would have to spike. And when I started in this industry, stocks and bonds were inversely correlated to one another. It was called risk on and risk off. And when you realize that they are now positively correlated to one another because interest rates have been driven so low, a spike in interest rates cripples both the bond and the stock market and, of course, the real estate market. The pillars of wealth in the United States center around stocks, bonds, and real estate. If the dollar gets dumped globally, and there's way more dollars outside the U.S. than there are domestically, if all of a sudden they get dumped globally because you don't have to hold them to buy oil anymore, and they hit our shore, spiking interest rates, you see a collapse simultaneously in all three pillars of wealth, including the dollar.
On this idea of oil, though, there has been an attempted shift away from oil towards solar, towards natural gas, towards various other forms of clean energy, nuclear even perhaps. So is it that relevant what
No.
oil is priced in?
No, because
if
I
the
think-
shift is away from oil?
No, because this is the whole reason that OPEC and Saudi Arabia want to leave us. Why would they want to not only receive our depreciating dollars and treasuries and sell us their oil when we're telling them in 30 years we're going to be completely green? So instead they're focusing their energy on what amounts to north of 80% of human population who is not going green and who is not challenging their way of life. And so I think it is actually the catalyst by which Saudi Arabia makes this shift. Once they have their alliances and they feel safe, I think they'll make that switch, and it will happen quickly. I think when that switch flips, it happens really quickly. But no, I think in fact we're making a mistake by doing that. I think we're making a very big mistake by making the admission to the Saudis that we want to go green. We're ruining their way of life, is the way they're looking at it. So why would they want to do any special favors for us? And this is why they came out and said to Xi Jinping that you are our most important trade partner in oil today and for the next 50 years. That's a big deal because we've been their biggest trade partner for the last 50 years. So I think really it is the key point, only in reverse. So,
Okay.
yeah, it matters, but it matters more for them than it does for us.
Well, because you could say that developing countries have been put off by this idea. You guys have used carbon, fossil fuels to grow your economies. Now that we're trying to do the same, you're telling us, no, we can't do that and hampering our growth.
And that's why you see 152 countries on the Belt Road Initiative.
Yeah.
And these are all the developing nations. And that's exactly right. And this is this grouping of humanity that I think, and that's why I say the word hypocrisy. This is not my word. It's just my perception of the way that they would view us by making these declarations.
What about other commodities that are not oil that you would still need to use dollars to buy? Is that where the split then just comes in?
Well, I mean, you could argue you have to, as the dollar is the world reserve currency, all of these commodities come into play, and it's interesting. The president of one of the Asian countries, and it skips me right now, recently came out and said that these countries, because most of the rare earth metals are found in Eurasia, should institute a OPEC-style cartel for rare earth metals. You know, we're going green, yet most of what we need to make batteries are found in the Eurasian continent. Maybe you have to use dollars to convert to the new currency to buy rare earth metals. I don't think we've thought this through very well, and so I don't know if the dollar loses its reserve status, who's going to want to sell their
Ooh,
commodities for
going
dollars?
real
First,
slow
they'll have
on
to
this.
convert to whatever it is they want to accept.
All right, and as you said, you're joining the dots, data points that seem to be making sense in this narrative that seems to be unfolding. What would be a projected timeline?
You know, I don't know. I think the timing is the hard part, but I will say this. When I started talking about this 3 years ago, it was spinning slowly, and you can see the rapid ascension and the progression of these alliances being made. And just in the last few weeks, we see Saudi Arabia make that admission about China being their most important trade partner. And just last week, the admission that they're willing to accept other currencies for oil. It seems to be accelerating, and since the weaponization of the dollar in 2022, it seems to be spinning much, much faster. I don't know when the switch flips, but sooner than we probably think.
Let's now connect the two parts of de-dollarization and the Great Reset, which is an agenda of the World Economic Forum, best crystallized by the line, "You shall owe nothing and be happy," and their timeline, which of course is 2030. So make the connection for us between de-dollarization and the Great Reset, and also explaining further what the Great Reset is.
Well, that's just what I said. You have asset prices stratospherically high, where price discovery has become impossible because of the distortions in the money supply and in interest rates. And it's created environments where corporations can buy back their shares, where hedge funds can borrow money and plow it into the markets and make huge returns and huge bonuses, but have created distortions in asset prices. So if we see that moment, and when, you know, I tried to factor in what Klaus Schwab said and the possibility of it happening, and it all centers around the weaponization of the dollar. Wasn't intended. Did they know that by making this unilateral move that it would create a backlash and have a villain to point to? OPEC and Russia and China, and they did it, we did it, they did it to us. And in that environment where asset prices are very high and the dollar is forsaken, creating that environment of spiked interest rates and an inflationary tsunami of dollars hitting our shore, you see everything collapse. That's when they would come in and roll out their new CBDC. We know that they're already doing it. They're already creating it. The Bank of International Settlements said every country has to have it by 2025. This gives them cover to roll it in. If you look at the Fed, the number 2 person at the Fed is Lael Brainerd. In fact, I thought she was going to actually win the spot for the Fed instead of Powell. They reappointed him, but they made her number 2. She's a modern monetary theorist. She wants to get rid of the commercial banks. She wants to do monetary policy directly to your iPhone. And so it would fit perfectly that this would happen sometime in the next few years anyway, where she could come in and administer a central bank digital currency and from the ashes of what would be a new system. And maybe they come out and issue a gold-backed CBDC. Who knows? The point of it is that if you wanted to create a reset, and I couldn't think of any other way that they could do it, because look, if Powell wanted to create a reset himself, all he would have had to do is jacked up the reserve requirements of the banks and raise interest rates to 20%, just like Paul Volcker did. Bang, it's over, just like that. Instead, they pussyfoot around with 1/4.5 point interest rates that still render the return on the 10-year Treasury negative. They're not doing anything to fix inflation. So if they really wanted to reset the system, jack up asset prices, and then incentivize the world to find an alternative, weaponize the dollar, and it's done for you with a villain to point to. That's why I put the dots together. Not saying it's going to happen, just simply saying, what's that, Occam's razor? You put everything together, and maybe the most plausible, logical explanation is the right one. I hope I'm wrong. My youngest is 15 years old, and I don't want to be right, but I have a feeling, unfortunately, that I am.
Well, on the Oxford Razor, you could say that the simplest explanation is just sheer incompetence. Never attribute to malice what can be